Chapter 9: Early Progress. Although I had adopted a series of measures for putting the army in order and for reorganization behind the front, I had not forgotten how necessary it was to provide for an evacuation in case of misfortune, and I was continually begging for fresh consignments of coal to be sent from Constantinople. If we should be forced to leave out native soil, we would not be able to count on the sympathy of other countries. Probably not one of them would offer us a refuge. The Slav countries alone, especially Serbia, who owed everything to Greater Russia, might prove exceptions. I wrote to Prince Alexander of Serbia, asking for shelter and protection should the worst happen. I wrote that I was doing my utmost to save the last shred of my country from Red domination, that I was trying to believe that God would help me, but that I had to be prepared for the worst. It was nearly Easter. How different it was from the same season in former years. Spring was at its height, and the churches were full, but there was not that air of gay expectancy which is customary on the eve of a festival. Prices were rising rapidly, and there was a food shortage. Everyone was living in fear of a terrible future. On Good Friday, I went to confession, and the next day to communion. After midnight mass in the cathedral, I had a meal in the officers' mess of the Cossack Regiment of the Guard, which was garrisoned at Sebastopol. It was one of the reduced regiments which had kept its old officers. Most of those who were now commanding Sotnius had commanded much smaller units during the Great War. On March 31st, a fierce engagement took place in the Perekop area. The Reds had concentrated nearly 3,000 cavalry and had attempted to launch an offensive, but our counterattack had thrown them back. On April 1st, our right flank detachment, which was to draw off the Red reserves, disembarked without incident near the village of Kirilovka, 40 versts to the northeast of Genichesk. But whilst it was advancing to join us in the Genichesk area, the Reds attacked and repulsed it, inflicting heavy losses. However, our units captured the southern suburb of Genichesk the next day, and simultaneously our left flank troops disembarked near Korli. The landing took place under difficult conditions. The Reds were holding Korli with 2 regiments well equipped with rifles and 4 pieces of artillery. These had been installed expressly for the purpose of bombarding the only canal we held which ran into the seaport. Nevertheless, our troops overcame all difficulties, thanks to the help of the sailors. The following day, our right flank units made a second effort to advance, and simultaneously the right flank units of the Crimean contingent, led by the gallant General Angoladze, attacked the Savache station and captured it. The Savache bridge, which had been damaged by the enemy, was quickly repaired, and our units continued to advance. Supported by armored cars, they occupied Chongar station, which had been fortified by the enemy. A fierce battle was waged in the Perekop zone on April 3rd and lasted the whole day. Our troops repulsed every attack the enemy made. On the same day, our left flank troops, following up the offensive, seized 4 of the enemy's guns and all their equipment. The troops had fought brilliantly, for they had been surrounded by the enemy and had been very short of ammunition. On the evening of the 3rd, I left for the front, and late the next morning arrived at Taganok station. There I joined General Slashchov and motored with him to join our troops who were advancing on Jimbaluk station. Bishop Benjamin was with us, for he wished to accompany me. Our forces were attacking, supported by fire from an armored car. The enemy had withdrawn, but were bombarding our lines. Our skirmishers were lying low on the plain. The enemy's shells had thrown up fountains of liquid black mud. I got out of the car and walked down the ranks of the sharpshooters, greeting the men and thanking them for the fine work they had done the previous evening. Bishop Benjamin, cross in hand, blessed the skirmishers. General Angoladze, the divisional commander, put himself at the head of the skirmishers and led the attack. They soon captured Jimbuluk station, which had been fortified by the Reds. The enemy abandoned the Chongar Peninsula in disorder and retreated, pursued by our units. I visited our reserve troops and then returned to Jankoy station, motoring to Perekop from there. The next morning, General Angoladze's command captured Salkovo station. Meanwhile, our left flank had continued its advance, repulsed the enemy's cavalry attack, broken through the Red Front south of Preobrajenka, and rejoined our forces at Perekop, bringing with them all the wounded and the trophies they had wrested from the enemy. During the fight, General Vitkovsky, commander of the left-wing units, had had 2 horses killed under him, and we had taken 6 big guns and 60 machine guns. The task I had set the troops was accomplished. The repercussions on the morale of the troops were more important than the actual successes. These last battles had shown that the army still retained its old invincible spirit, and whilst that was still alive, all was not lost. Word had reached Sebastopol that hostilities had begun again on the Polish front. The Polish troops had taken up the offensive and forced the Reds to give ground. Our military situation, which had been so difficult a little while ago, was now a trifle easier. We hoped that the enemy would concentrate on the advancing Poles and give us a respite, which we could use profitably in many ways. The troops were ordered to proceed at once with the fortification of the positions they had conquered. At the same time, they were to begin preparing fortified lines in the rear. On my way back to Sebastopol, I stopped at Simferopol for an hour or so and received several visitors in my carriage, including M. Radimov, director of a daily newspaper, the Upodorysky Vestnik, who had requested a personal interview with me. He asked that the Supreme Command should support his newspaper, which was entirely sympathetic to the army. He was in a very difficult position in Upatona. The general staff of the Don Army Corps would not support his publication, for it published its own paper, the Donskoy Vestnik, and regarded M. Radimov's paper as its rival and opponent. The views of the Don paper were frankly hostile to the Supreme Command. To support his statements, M. Radimov presented me with a whole series of copies of the Donskoy Vestnik. I ran through them and was absolutely staggered. I knew perfectly well that this paper was produced by the commander of the Don Army Corps and his chief of staff. Its director was Count Dushela, chief of the Cossack squadron, and I had heard very unfavorable reports of him. He had taken part in the political disturbances in the Don which had been directed against the Supreme Command. That there was a spirit of opposition at work amongst the officers of the Don Army, I knew quite well, but what I now saw exceeded all my apprehensions. In a series of articles in this official paper, inadmissible attempts were made to rouse the hostility of the Cossacks against the volunteers and to excite them against the generals and high dignitaries. The idea of the secession of the Cossack districts from Russia was also broached. I really did not know which to admire more: the utter vileness of the treason of these men who were at the head of the Don troops, or the coolness of their work. Open and undisguised as it was, I suggested to M. Radimov that he should come with me to Sebastopol. As soon as we arrived, I sent for General Bogorevsky, the ataman of the Don, and gave him the copies or the Donskoy Vestnik that I had received from M. Radimov. I suggested that he should see M. Radimov himself. I left the two of them together and went into my study. Thereupon I drew up a general order enjoining Lieutenant General Sidorin to delegate his work to General Abramov, dismissing Lieutenant General Kelchevsky, the Chief of Staff, and summoning Count Dushela, the editor of the political section and the director of the paper, before a military tribunal. The police magistrate for important cases received an order to try this case immediately and to conduct an inquiry so that we might discover the names of any others who were also guilty, that they too could be tried. After I had drawn up this order, I went back to General Bogorevsky. He was standing by the window, reading a copy of the Donskoy Vestnik. He looked very baffled and sheepish. I showed him my general order. "Have you anything to add?" "No, of course not," muttered the ataman in strangled tones and with a visible effort. I immediately signed the order and gave it to my aide-de-camp, who saw to its execution. The inquiry revealed that Generals Sidorin and Kelchevsky were the ringleaders. Count Duchela had played only a minor part. He attempted to commit suicide when he was arrested and wounded himself very seriously. General Sidorin tried to win the support of the officers of the Don Command, but with no response. I studied the report of the inquiry and ordered Sidorin, Kelchevsky, and Duchela to be indicted before a military tribunal, of which General Dragomirov was president. The tribunal sentenced the two generals to hard labor. I commuted the sentence to dismissal from the service and prohibition to wear uniform. As Count Ducella was in hospital recovering from his self-inflicted wounds, his trial was conducted separately and did not come up before the tribunal until much later. The tribunal took into consideration the fact that Count Ducella was only a common adventurer and a minor accomplice, and since I had seen fit to reduce the sentence of the principal offenders, they acquitted him. He went abroad and continued his policy of hostility to the army even after we had evacuated our native territory. A vigorous blow had put an end to the machinations of the Don Command, and the intriguing and lying of the dissatisfied generals ceased. They felt that they could no longer fish in troubled waters with impunity. Most of these gentlemen left the Crimea with all speed, and that was that. But General Slokchov could not calm down again. He noticed that I carefully avoided discussing with him questions which had no connection with his command, so began to bombard me with his incoherent dispatches. In Simferopol, General Kutupov was keeping order amongst his troops with an iron hand. The court-martial was ruthless in its sentences, and all pillagers and deserters were executed. Local liberal clubs, led by M. Usov, the mayor of Simferopol, were in violent opposition to General Kutupov. M. Usov sent him protests against capital punishment, etc., in the name of the whole group. I invited the mayor to come to Sebastopol the next day. The liberal press announced his departure and hinted that the commander-in-chief's invitation to the mayor foreshadowed changes in the military administration, and that the Supreme Command evidently intended to proceed against certain administrators who had exceeded their authority. The mayor came into my study with an air of victory, but when he saw that I neither held out my hand to him nor asked him to sit down, he seemed disconcerted. "I know all about your disagreement with General Kutupov, who is merely carrying out my orders," I told him. "I am not going to discuss with you who is in the right or which of us two has given orders. I am responsible to the army and the people, and I follow the dictates of my mind and conscience. I am quite sure that were you in my place, you would act quite differently, but as it happens, destiny has given me and not you the direction of the Russian cause, and I will do my duty as I see it. Furthermore, I will stop at nothing in the accomplishment of my duty and will not hesitate to cut down anyone who tries to stop me. You protest because General Kutupov has hanged a score or so of men who were a danger to the army and our cause. I warn you that should the necessity arise, I would not hesitate to increase the number by one, and that one would be yourself." The mayor left my study, obviously crushed. The next day, the newspapers said that the mayor of Simferopol had come back from Sebastopol, but that he refused to give any details of his interview with the commander-in-chief. A few days later, the same papers announced that M. Usov was seriously ill and had resigned his mayoralty. General Ulagay had come over to Sebastopol again from the Caucasian front. With him was General Starikov, the commander of the Don Army Corps. General Ulagay's attempts to launch an offensive had been so much trouble wasted. The Cossacks would not fight anymore. Discord was rife between the Kuban government, the Rada, and the commanders of the Kuban and Don troops. Generals Ulagay and Starikov were insisting on the transfer of Cossacks from the Kuban into the Crimea, but General Bukretov, the ataman of the Kuban, refused to give his consent. I called a conference consisting of the atamans of the Don, Kuban, and Terek, Generals Ulagay, Starikov, Chatalov, and Makarov, and the commander of the fleet. Ulagay and Starikov repeated their statements. The atamans of the Don and Terek supported them, but General Bukretov again declared that he considered the transfer to be undesirable and that in his capacity of ataman, he felt that he must consult all the Cossacks on the subject. I replied that it was unthinkable that the Cossacks should be allowed to discuss their officers' orders. General Bukretov countered with, "And I, as their ataman, cannot allow them to be transferred to the Crimea. The volunteer army has always been a stepmother to them. I cannot see any reason for doing it. It is not true that the Cossacks will not fight. It is only their superiors, generals, Ulagay, Chkoro, Naumenko, Babiev, and others who will not fight. If that is so, let General Bukretov command the army himself, General Ulagai burst out. I silenced him and spoke to Bukratov. You are accusing the superior officers of lacking the will to fight. I have known them for a long time, and I cannot believe you. But your remarks have convinced me that the Supreme Command cannot be exercising the necessary authority over the Cossacks in view of the attitude of the Ataman, the government, and the Rada. You have assured us that the Cossacks are ready to fight under new officers. I am delighted to hear it. Take the command of the Caucasian army yourself and go and fight the Bolshevists. Oh no, I will not accept the command myself, he cried. Well then, we have nothing further to discuss, I said. You refuse to shoulder your responsibilities, and I cannot tolerate irresponsible persons inciting the Cossacks against the command. Get out, but do not leave the Crimea. I turned to Admiral Gerasimov. Please see that no vessel leaving the Crimea takes General Bukratov on board. General Bukratov hurried out. Everyone present seemed somewhat confused. Generals Bogorevsky and Vdovenko tried to persuade me to revoke my decision. The Ataman's person is inviolable, said General Bogorevsky. You, in cooperation with the Atamans, have just promulgated an edict confirming the autonomous rights of the Cossacks. The sequestration of General Bukratov will make a very bad impression on them. General Chatov also tried to persuade me, but I held firmly to my own view. I cannot allow General Bukratov to go back to the army and continue his propaganda. I do not believe him for a moment when he says that the Cossacks want to fight, but he is responsible for all that has just happened, I replied. At last, General Chatalov suggested that he should go to General Bukratov's house and have a private talk with him. A half an hour later, General Chatalov came back and announced that General Bukratov had consented to accept the command of the army. I requested him to go back again and tell the Ataman that I regretted our little misunderstanding and begged him to rejoin the conference. General Bukratov came back. I am very pleased that you have reconsidered your decision and are ready to take upon yourself this heavy responsibility. Let us forget all our misunderstandings, I said to him, my hand outstretched. I signed the order appointing General Bukratov commander of the army straight away and put Generals Ulagai, Chkoro, Naumenko, and Babiev at his disposal. On April 9th, I presided over my first council of the chief administrative officials. It was being borne in upon me more and more strongly that the men at the head of the different branches of the administration were not capable of performing the gigantic task which destiny had thrust upon them. The whole civil and economic life of the country was disorganized. All its fundamentals had to be recreated, not merely reconstructed, but actually recreated in the strictest sense of the word, when all the new political and economical conditions were taken into account. Only men with the widest knowledge, the greatest administrative experience, and quite unusual political adaptability could have coped with the problems of the moment, and it was difficult to find men with both the last two qualities. The most experienced administrators had acquired their tact and knowledge of affairs in the service of the old Russian bureaucracy with all its traditions, and from these traditions they could not free themselves. They could not do any good work unless they had stable, complete administrative machinery, which was entirely lacking during the Civil War. It was inevitable that they should apply all the negative characteristics of the old bureaucracy to their work. They did not know how to estimate the real needs of the population and complicated all their actions with the inevitable red tape. They were slow, as are all bureaucracies, and set great store by out-of-date procedure. Creative work inventing its own forms was a necessity in a period of revolutionary upheaval, and this was beyond their powers. But the colleagues General Denikin had chosen from liberal circles were even less able to cope with their work than ex-imperialists. They were for the most part men of words and not of action, members of the intelligentsia who showed themselves to be incapable of action even in the political battlefield. They were incapable of any creative work, for they had neither the necessary knowledge nor the bureaucratic experience. I realized quite clearly that under the abnormally difficult conditions which then prevailed, only a statesman of uncommon ability could cope with the gigantic task awaiting us in the Crimea. I was convinced that the only man great enough for the task was Fyotr Krivochain. I had known him personally for a long time. All Russia had recognized his statesmanlike work years ago. He had a masterful character and an extraordinary capacity for work, and during his long career had studied the most diverse branches of the administration. He had served in the Ministry of the Interior in the department which dealt with the affairs of the Zemstvos, and there had gained a deep knowledge of the peasant question. He had been in the State Agrarian Bank and was ex-chief of the Emigration Department, an annex to the Ministry of Finance. In this last capacity, he had given a strong impetus to the activities of the Peasant Bank and had put it on the way to creating small peasant proprietors. For 6 years, he had been Minister of Agriculture and P.A. Stolypin's most intimate colleague, and had earned out his agrarian reforms for him. He owed his high position in the bureaucracy entirely to himself and his personal qualities. He occupied an exceptionally high position in administrative spheres, and at the same time wielded unusual authority in the political circles of society. A distinguished administrator himself, he had the knack of always choosing good colleagues. Many of them filled important posts in different branches of the administration after they had been trained under him. He was an exceptionally learned man, very cultured and broad-minded, with dearly formulated and well-defined opinions. He was tolerant, too, and had the rare gift of being able to see other people's point of view. He could win over his hearer by avoiding, with the most consummate tact, every topic that might offend him. By reason of his early work, he belonged to the older school or statesmen, and obviously was not one of those who were ready to throw in their lot with the revolution, although he clearly realized the necessity of reckoning with it. He knew how to adapt himself to the new conditions of work which required continual changes and did not admit of any conventional routine. I realized what enormous sacrifices Krivochin would have to make if he consented to share my heavy load with me. But, knowing him, I hoped that he would consent. An ardent patriot and a man with a sense of duty would make this sacrifice for his country. N.M. Kothorevsky left for Paris on April 9th, taking my letter to Krivochain. The early progress of the new regime did something to reassure the population, for energetic steps had been taken to re-establish order in the interior, and there had been a victory at the front recently. But the real situation was still unknown. Enemy propaganda was having its effect. In the many interviews I had with representatives of the civil and military powers and with politicians, I noticed that each one expected pronouncements from the new rulers on all the burning questions of the day: the agrarian question, our relations with the Cossacks, the new states on Russian territory, and Western Europe. Admiral McCully, the chief of the American mission, who was very well disposed towards us, and also General Mangin, chief of the French mission, both pointed out to me the necessity for making my opinions public, in order to guard against the suggestive rumors which were being circulated in foreign circles about the change of power. I bowed to public opinion, invited press representatives to call on me, and expressed the following views to them on the problems of the moment. After 6 days of hard fighting, we have taken the Crimean passes and have entrenched our position. The army is being reorganized with all speed and is falling into some sort of order again after the ordeals it has suffered. In the very near future, I am going to introduce a whole series of organization measures which should eliminate some of the defects which make the administration of the army so difficult. A series of measures for raising the moral tone of the army have already been put into force. Tribunals of honor with wide powers have been set up for the officers in the units. They can even degrade superior officers. Simultaneously with the above measures, we will attempt to settle the most urgent questions affecting national life. 3 years of anarchy, combined with the frequent changes of government, have complicated the problems of industrial and economic life, and they cannot be settled at one blow. Each new government adopted a program likely to capture the sympathies of the population by seductive promises which nobody could possibly fulfill. The agrarian question is a case in point. I am endeavoring to settle the most vital questions and yet remain within the bounds of possibility. The essential task before the authorities is the creation of a rule of law for the people of that part of South Russia which is occupied by my troops, so that they can subsequently fulfill their promises in the most comprehensive way. I am preparing measures which will enable the workers on the land to obtain as large a plot of ground as possible in individual ownership. The future of Russian agriculture belongs to the small peasant proprietor. Big landed estates have had their day. The improvement of the material welfare of the workers and the satisfaction of their industrial needs is one of our principal cares. Let us now turn to the causes of our failure. They are many. They can be summed up by saying that strategy was sacrificed to a policy, and what is more, to a worthless policy. Instead of uniting all the forces fighting Bolshevist communism and evolving one policy for them, a Russian policy, free from all party spirit, a partisan, voluntarist policy was adopted, whose directors were the enemies of Russia in everything that did not bear the mark of voluntarism. They fought the Bolshevists, it is true. They also fought the Ukrainians, the Georgians, and the Azerbaijanians. It needed very little to set them fighting the Cossacks, who made up half our army and who had declared their indissoluble union with the regular troops by the blood they had shed on the field of honor. In short, having proclaimed the principle of Greater Russia, one and indivisible, they proceeded to disrupt all the Russian anti-Bolshevist forces and to divide Russia up into a chaos of impromptu states fighting one against the other. I visualize quite another way of resurrection for Russia. A few days ago, I signed an agreement with representatives of all the Cossack troops, defining the conditions which are to govern our relations with one another. The Cossack states are to keep their autonomy in internal affairs, but their armed forces are to be subordinate to us on certain conditions. Outside the Cossack states, I have assumed full and unlimited civil and military power. In questions of internal policy, I intend to rely largely on the cooperation of public opinion. We are within a besieged fortress, and only a strong and united power can save the situation. The prime necessity is that of fighting the enemy. We have no time for party warfare. When the specter of Bolshevism, which threatens us all, is laid, popular wisdom will find a political formula which will satisfy all classes of the population. But until the struggle is over, all parties must be as one and do the necessary work without any partisan spirit. The strictly simplified administrative machinery that I am setting up contains no party men, only workers. I recognize neither monarchists nor republicans, but only clever men and hard workers. I hold the same opinion on the question of orientations. Make agreements with whoever you like, but my watchword is for Russia. As for the German orientation of which people have been writing and talking for the last few weeks, I cannot take it seriously. Germany is exhausted after the war and absorbed in her home affairs. It is obvious that she cannot give effective support to any other country. It is not by a triumphal march from the Crimea to Moscow that Russia can be freed, but by the creation, on no matter how small a fragment of Russian soil, of such a government with such conditions of life that the Russian people now groaning under the red yoke will inevitably submit to its attractions. On April 11th, I appointed a commission to study the agrarian question. Its president was Senator Glinka, the ex-director of the Emigration Bureau and one of Avi Krivochen's most intimate colleagues. I realized that the agrarian question could not be settled satisfactorily if it were treated as one problem, for Russia is so immense and its ethnographical and economic variations so many. Moreover, dissolution and anarchy had ruined the economic life of the country and falsified all legal relations. Any decision would provoke much discontent, and we would have to correct our errors later in the light of experience. But present conditions of life forbade us to delay any longer. The Gordian knot had to be cut. The question had to be settled for an important psychological reason. We had to tear the enemy's principal weapon of propaganda from him, kindle the imagination of the army and the populace, and make a favorable impression on foreign opinion. From the first moment I set foot in the Crimea, I realized how necessary it was to re-establish the bare elements of normal justice, for all such ideas had been badly shaken during the years of civil war. The absence of a strong legal government and of a law-abiding spirit was one of the principal causes of the dissolution of General Denikin's army. The troops had become demoralized. The supreme military jurisdiction under the Attorney General for the Army and Navy was powerless. One of the Commander-in-Chief's edicts gave the immediate superior of an offender the right to institute criminal proceedings against him and try him. The Army Corps tribunals, composed of competent jurists, were almost at a standstill. Quite half the total number of cases were never heard at all, except in the courts-martial, which were absolutely dependent on the military leaders. These courts-martial became the most active dispensers of justice, and composed as they were of men who for the most part lacked the most rudimentary knowledge of the law, they often committed the grossest errors which were irreparable, and which undermined the very foundations of the idea of justice and legality. Thus the good name of justice was compromised. My order of April 6th decreed that henceforth judicial proceedings should depend not on the goodwill of the military authorities, but on the attorney, who was to present the indictment to a competent tribunal, at the same time informing the accused's immediate superior so that he could issue the necessary order. Parallel to other measures for the stamping out of pillaging and brigandage, an order of April 14th set up special commissions with military jurisdiction for the commanders of garrisons and fortresses, and later on for the general staffs of Army Corps, divisions, and isolated brigades. These commissions, consisting of a president and 5 members, were selected as far as possible from men who had had a special legal education. The secretary had to be one of these. They were directly subordinate to the Attorney General. Cases of murder, pillaging, theft, illegal requisitioning, and any other illegal action against the inhabitants of the area, if committed by a soldier, all came within their competence. The geographical limits of each commission's authority were the boundaries of the district, or alternatively, it took cognizance of crimes committed by any member of a particular military formation. A little later, the better to guarantee the interests of the civil population, representatives of the peasants were also put on the commissions. Every Volost district was entitled to 2 representatives with deliberative powers and the right to be present at judicial inquiries. The Chief Commission had to record in a special process verbal all the opinions expressed by the representatives of the Volost, and act on them if they were not contrary to the law and could be executed without prejudice to the inquiry. The trial was conducted by one of the members of the commission, who had the powers of a police court magistrate, but was not bound to observe all the formalities that the law had provided for judicial proceedings of earlier days. It is true that this arrangement led to a certain amount of confusion between the functions of the attorney and the judge, but this was inevitable owing to the conditions under which the commissions worked. They had to have full powers and independence to ensure quick and decisive action. Nevertheless, the member of the commission who had conducted the examination did not have a voice in the final verdict. As for procedure, the special commissions had to adopt the system on which the courts-martial worked. The verdicts had to be ratified by competent military chiefs. If these did not agree with the verdict, the case passed to the Army Corps Tribunal or to that of the military district. Throughout the whole period of the struggle in the Crimea, these commissions with military jurisdiction rendered invaluable services to the government in its campaign against the various abuses which were corrupting the army. Pillaging by the troops ceased almost entirely. Besides the testimonial of numerous impartial witnesses, I also received a whole series of resolutions adopted by village assemblies, thanking me for having set up these commissions which had delivered the people from extortion and pillaging. These bore witness to the utility of the commissions better than any words of mine can do. Even the section of the Crimean press, which had denounced the commissions at first, finally recognized their usefulness. Other edicts excluded cases against minors between the ages of 10 and 17 from the competence of the courts-martial and prohibited public executions. In view of the prevailing callousness, public executions no longer served to intimidate. They merely aggravated the existing state of moral apathy. Our political position was still uncertain. On April 6, 19th, Admiral Seymour sent me the following note. The Admiralty begs to inform you that on Saturday, April 17th, Lord Curzon sent a telegram to M. Chicherin saying that although the armed forces of South Russia have been defeated, they cannot be allowed to go on to disaster, and that should M. Chicherin not reply without delay, that he is at least ready to accept Lord Curzon's mediation and suspend all further offensive action in the South. His Majesty's government will be obliged to order His Majesty's fleet to take all necessary steps for the protection of the Crimean army and the prevention of the invasion of their place of retreat by the Soviet forces. At the same time, General Mangin, chief of the French mission, wrote to Struve, "As a result of our conversation of today, I have the honor to enclose an extract from the telegram from the Minister of Marine of the French Republic, which I have already sent to General Baron Wrangel. The French government will act in concert with the British government in supporting General Wrangel with material help so that he will not be forced to make an armistice with the Soviet on their conditions, but will be in a position to make a proper treaty on behalf of his army." On April 11, 24th, Nyatov, our diplomatic representative at Constantinople, telegraphed, "According to a Bolshevist radiogram, Curzon has sent an ultimatum to Moscow. An armistice is to be signed with the volunteer army, and if hostilities continue, he threatens intervention by the English fleet. Chicherin has agreed to begin peace negotiations immediately." But 5 days later, General Percy, head of the English mission, sent me the following note. British Military Missions Headquarters, April 29, 1920. Your Excellency, General Milne, Commander-in-Chief of the Black Sea Army, charges me to communicate to you the following message from Lord Curzon to Admiral de Robeck, High Commissioner. The answers that we have received from M. Chicherin in reference to our attempts to make terms for General Wrangel's Crimean forces have not been encouraging up to now. Instead of stating the Soviets' conditions, as we asked him to do, Chicherin is trying to obtain further political concessions which we cannot grant him. Therefore, we are powerless for the moment to obtain what General Wrangel demands. Should we be unable to make terms for him, as seems probable, the only alternative is for him to do what he can for himself. Should General Wrangel prolong the struggle, it can have only one result, and we cannot encourage it by subsidies in money or kind. Brigadier General Percy, Chief of the British Military Mission, to His Excellency, the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia. In the meantime, negotiations between the Poles and the Bolshevists had been broken off, and the Polish troops had launched an offensive and thrust back the Reds all along the front. Therefore, they hastily concentrated all their forces on the Western Front. The fall of the Crimea would leave the Red Command free to concentrate all their efforts against the Poles. France, who invariably supported Poland, had naturally realized this. Therefore, the French government would not sympathize with the new English policy. On my initiative, Struve telegraphed to our ambassador in Paris, V.A. Maklakov, and asked him to sound the French government as to their intentions. Maklakov telegraphed on April 18, May 1st, French government hostile to entente with Bolshevists will not use any pressure to secure capitulation of Crimea, will not participate in any mediation aiming at this, even if others undertake it, sympathizes with idea of defending Crimea and the Taurek province. French government considers Bolshevism to be Russia's principal enemy and therefore sympathizes with Polish offensive, will not countenance idea of a camouflaged annexation of the Dnieper area. If a Ukrainian government is set up, will only recognize it de facto. I answered the British government's note of April 16th to 29th by a letter to General Percy on April 16th, May 2nd. On April 2nd, the British government invited General Denikin to end the civil war, warning him that if he did not comply, they would withdraw their support from the armed forces of South Russia. I had become commander-in-chief by then, so I informed the British government that since I had no choice but to obey their demand, I surrendered the army, the navy, and the population of South Russia to the good offices of His Britannic Majesty's government. I believed we could trust them implicitly to regard it as a question of honor to save all those who did not wish to accept the enemy's mercy. I indicated at the same time that it was absolutely impossible for us to negotiate directly with the enemy. Lord Curzon's communication to M. Chicherin, which Admiral Seymour sent on to me, contains an explicit declaration that should the Soviet government refuse to accept English mediation, or should there be a fresh offensive on the southern front, the British government will order its ships to protect my army and avert a Soviet invasion of the refuge which the armed forces of South Russia have found in the Crimea. In your letter of April 29th, you communicated to me the gist of Lord Curzon's message to the British High Commissioner at Constantinople. It seems that M. Chicherin has brought forward certain political claims which are unacceptable, and that therefore the British government has decided that the only possible course still open is for me to try and obtain for myself the conditions I want from the Soviet government. I cannot believe that the British government now intends to renounce the role of mediator, which it assumed on learning that I could not possibly enter into direct negotiations with the enemy. I realize the difficulties of the situation in which the Kubanian troops now find themselves, isolated as they are along the shores of the Caucasian, and I have authorized Ataman General Bukratov to negotiate for himself, releasing him from the obligation which binds him in his capacity of Ataman to enter into no separate negotiation or arrangement. General Bukratov, forced to open negotiations with the Bolshevists under peculiarly unfavorable conditions, has asked me today to send him transport enough for at least 10,000 men, so that he will be in a position to transfer those who refuse to yield to the Soviet power to the Crimea. I am arranging to do as he asks. This incident is one more proof that neither amnesty nor promise of any kind will bring peace to Bolshevist Russia if the people themselves are not willing to tolerate the Bolshevist rule. The popular insurrection in the Upper Don in the April of last year, in which 40,000 Cossacks took part, and which was headed exclusively by non-commissioned officers except for just one Cossack officer of higher rank, and the using which has just begun in Isk and Timochevka on territory recently occupied by the Bolshevists, just at the moment when the Ataman and the Kuban government are opening negotiations, are also witnesses. The sole method of saving Russia from permanent anarchy is to preserve a healthy nucleus around which all the movements which have broken away from the tyranny of Bolshevism by brute force can group themselves. Russia cannot be saved from the danger which threatens to engulf her and all Europe by another march on Moscow, but by the union of all the popular anti-communist forces. Hence, the integrity of the territory occupied by the armed forces of South Russia, as well as of the Cossack territories, is a fundamental necessity if we are to attain the goal that the Allies have set up, the goal that is really incumbent upon the whole civilized world, i.e., the ending of the Civil War and of Russian anarchy. To facilitate the British government's negotiations with the Soviet, I propose to send special delegates to London, men who understand the present situation in my territories and the Cossack states, and who know my intentions. Finally, I think I ought to point out to the British government, as well as to all the powers of the Entente, the danger which they themselves run from the situation they have created by their decision to deprive me and my army of all support at this critical moment. This decision was not made as a result of any action of mine. Their action is equivalent to a victory for the Soviet powers and a capitulation to communism, and it will, of necessity, influence the feelings of the Russian people who will not compromise with the Soviets towards the Allies in future. Will you be good enough to transmit this to His Britannic Majesty's government? In mid-April, the Bolsheviks resumed the offensive in Caucasia and occupied Sochi. General Morozov, the commander of the Kubanian army, and some members of the Rada began to negotiate with the Bolshevists with General Bukratov's consent. When I heard this, I ordered all our available tonnage to be sent to the port of Adler, and sent an urgent petition to Admiral de Robeck for the cooperation of the English fleet. General Chkuro was just leaving for Adler too, So I entrusted him with the task of commanding those troops which should refuse to negotiate with the Bolshevists and of transferring them to the Crimea. The embarkation was effected by means of rowing boats under the most difficult conditions. The men were put onto Russian transport ships and English men of war. Horses, big guns, and machine guns had to be abandoned. Only the Don Cossacks had reached the Crimea after the evacuation of Novorossiysk. This time, I ordered the Kubanian Cossacks to be embarked first. General Bukretov and Morozov and members of the Kubanian government and Rada had persuaded officers and Cossacks that the Crimea was an ambush, and that within a few days, all the units of the army there would be forced to capitulate. The embarkation was finished on April 19th, and the ships sailed for the Crimea. Many of the Kubanian Cossacks did capitulate, a small minority took refuge in the mountains, and the rest embarked, as the majority of the Don regiments and the brigade of Terek and Astrakhan Cossacks had done. General Bukretov himself resigned his atamanship, giving up his insignia to the president of the government in accordance with the laws of the constitution. The president, the engineer Ivanis, fled to Georgia. He was followed by the separatist members of the Kuban Rada, who took part of the regional funds with them. On April 21st, the troops who had been evacuated from the Caucasian coast reached Feodasia. I went over there the next day to review the regiments and chat with the officers. Most of the officers and Cossacks were my old comrades in arms who had fought under my command in northern Caucasia before Tsaritsyn. Only the most tenacious fighters had been sent to the Crimea. Those who had lost their faith or their courage had remained on the coasts of Caucasia. Everyone who had just arrived was furious at the treason of the Ataman and the separatist members of the Rada. I felt sure that the Cossack regiments, purged of traitors and cowards, freed from the disintegrating influence of demagogues in the Rada, trusting to energetic officers and rested and re-equipped with all they needed, would once more become those admirable units which had fought the enemy so grimly in northern Caucasia and on the Don. The Don regiments were sent to Upatona to join up with the Don Army Corps. The Kubanian units were reduced to one division, and the Terek and Astrakhan Brigade was attached to it. I put gallant General Babiev at its head. Babiev was one of the most brilliant cavalry generals in South Russia. He was brave and exceptionally high-spirited, and had a rare instinct for commanding cavalry. He was himself a first-class horseman, a jignite, to use the Caucasian term, and was adored by the officers and Cossacks. He had always been victorious, whether he was commanding a regiment, a brigade, or a division. His cavalry charges always threw the enemy's ranks into confusion. During the Great War and the Civil War, General Babiev, who was always to be found in the most dangerous places, had been wounded 19 times. His right arm was shorter than the other, but in spite of all his wounds, he had kept his irrepressible spirits. An ardent Russian patriot, he was highly indignant at the anti-national intrigues of the Cossack separatists. I could set my mind at rest about the units he was commanding. Some days before my journey to Feodasia, I had inspected the regiments of the Don Army Corps at Eupatoria. General Abramov was now at their head. He was an extremely brave man and incorruptibly honest, a very resolute leader, and an exceptionally tactful one. By birth, he was a Don Cossack, by education a staff officer. Before the revolution, he had commanded a division of regiments of the line, and for a long time had been quartermaster general to one of the armies. He had also commanded a brigade of Cossacks of the Guard in South Russia, where he was deservedly held in high esteem. Now at the head of an army corps, he was rooting out all the germs of disorder with a firm hand. He had discharged quite a number of superior officers and improved the morale of officers and Cossacks. I had no doubt that in a very short time he would restore the army corps to order and make it fit for battle. On this same journey, I went from Upatona to the front, where the units of the Crimean and Volunteer Army Corps were stationed. The regrouping which I had initiated had been carried out. The Crimean Army Corps was arranged in echelons along the railway in the Salkovo district. The volunteers were occupying the fort below Perekop. The students from the military schools who had fought in the ranks of General Slokchov's troops had been separated out, and it was made possible for these young men, some of them still almost children, whose lives were so precious to Russia, to continue their studies. The frontline units who had had time to rest, clean up, and fit themselves out seemed cheerful and confident. Fortifications were going forward rapidly, trenches were being dug, machine gun emplacements constructed, and barbed wire entanglements put up. Behind the lines, similar work was being done just as actively, and strategical railroads were being constructed with feverish haste. Discipline was much better, especially in the big towns. I insisted relentlessly that all the garrison officers should take the most energetic measures to put down disorders and slackness amongst the soldiers behind the lines. I gave orders that all those who were fit to fight were not to leave their units without real justification, and that all the wounded who had quite recovered were to leave hospital and return to the front immediately. I also insisted on the observation of the rules concerning uniform. On April 28th, I issued an edict changing the name of the Volunteer Army to that of the Russian Army. The Army Corps were to be known by numbers, and the Cossack troops by the name of the district from which they came. The name volunteer had been extended from the army to include the policy of those who directed it. It no longer meant certain military units. It had become the common name for the whole movement of which General Denikin had been the leader. The volunteerist party, press, and powers had become current terms. Glorious though it had been in the past, associated as it was with the early progress and heroic struggles of Generals Alexeyev and Kornilov, the term volunteerism, which had been so dear to all participants in the struggle, had with time lost its old attraction. It had been discredited in public opinion and even in the army because of the policy of General Denikin and his closest colleagues, the contemptible behavior of criminal elements which had infested the army, and the fatal conflict between the volunteerist, high command, and the Cossacks. Of the two armies fighting in Russia, the right to the name the Russian Army belonged to the one composed of men who had remained loyal to the national flag, sacrificing everything for the welfare and honor of their country. Obviously, the name Russian Army could not be given to troops whose leaders had replaced the Russian tricolor with the red flag, and the very name of Russia with the name International. It is true that there were also many honest Russians in the ranks of the Red Army, which was not as it had been 2 years previously. During the struggle in northern Caucasia, the Bolshevist troops had consisted of all the shady characters which the eddy of the revolution had thrown up from the lowest social strata. They were the very worst elements which has demoralized and disintegrated the Russian army. Such a foe deserved no mercy, but in the later stages of the struggle, both sides had been forced to use conscription. After that, the same elements were to be found in both armies. Their presence in one or the other depended largely on chance geographical circumstances. My predecessor had not reckoned with this factor. His narrow and uncompromising policy had persecuted not only all those whose ideas differed from his own, but also everyone who had dealings of any kind with hostile organizations, or even with organizations not sufficiently favorable to the volunteer cause. He had hunted down not only those who had been in touch with the Bolshevists in some way or another, perhaps against their will, but also anyone who had been connected with the Ukraine, the Georgian Republic, and so on. This insane and cruel policy provoked a reaction, alienated those who had been ready to become our allies, and turned into enemies those who had sought our friendship. We had not brought pardon and peace with us, but the cruel sword of vengeance. An incredible number of officers who had welcomed us as their liberators came under our command only to fall a prey to our suspicion and to languish under interminable inquiries. The same relationship had been established with the civil population in the recently occupied territories. Everyone became suspect, were their crime no greater than that of having sold to the Reds, of their own free will, means of transport for the conveyance of food, or of having accepted a post as clerk in a food cooperative center or a telegraph bureau because they were dying of hunger. By an edict of April 29th, I freed all the officers and soldiers who had given themselves up and come over to our side before or during the struggle, from every kind of proceeding and service restriction, as well as all those who had served previously in the Soviet Army, and who had, therefore, already undergone punishment and service restrictions after the territory had been occupied by the armed forces of South Russia of their own free will. They were all reinstated in the ranks and privileges they had held on December 1st, 1917. At the same time, all the officers and soldiers who had served the new states, Ukraine and Georgia, and who had undergone punishment and restrictions on that account were exempt from all further punishment or service restrictions. By an edict of June 8th, these concessions were also extended to the staffs of institutions and the civil administration. At the end of May, I addressed the following appeal to the officers of the Red Army. Officers of the Red Army, I, General Wrangel, have taken over the command of the remains of the Russian army. Not Red, but Russian. The army, which not long ago was still powerful and terrible to its enemies, and in the ranks of which many of you served. Russian officers have always served their country loyally and courageously. They have died that she might be happy. They are part of one united family. 3 years ago, the Russian army forgot its duty and opened the gates to the enemy, and the frenzied people began to burn and pillage their own native land. Now our mother Russia lies before us, ruined, dishonored, and covered with the blood of fratricidal warfare. For 3 terrible years, those officers who remained loyal to their sacred traditions have been treading the path to Calvary to save the honor and welfare of the country whose own sons have brought shame upon her. These blind, unconscious sons were under your command, one-time officers of the invincible Russian army. What has led you to follow this shameful course? What is it that has brought you to raise your hand against your old comrades in arms, your regimental colleagues? I have spoken to many of your number who have left the Red Army of their own free will. They all tell that mortal terror, hunger, and fear for the future impelled them to serve the Red scoundrels. Few men are capable of greatness of soul and total self-abnegation. Many of them tell me that at the bottom of their hearts they feel that they have fallen very low, but their fear of reprisals prevents them from coming over to us. I like to think that amongst you Red officers there are still some honest men in whose hearts' love of country is not dead. I call upon you to join us so that you may atone for your shame and once more join the ranks of the Russian army, the true Russian army. I, General Wrangel, Commander-in-Chief at this moment, give you the word of an old officer who has given the best years of his life to his country, that I will forget the past and give you an opportunity to atone for your errors. Regent and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of South Russia, General Wrangel, I ordered this proclamation to be distributed as widely as possible amongst the enemy. It was conveyed across the frontier by our agents and dropped from aeroplanes as though it were a tract. The difficulties of the agents of the military and civil administration worried me very much. The ever-increasing cost of living caused them much suffering, especially if they had families. I issued successive orders increasing their rations and providing help for the families of those who had died or been taken prisoner or abandoned during the evacuation of Odessa and Novorossiysk. Simultaneously, I began to reduce the staff of officials, which had swollen to impossibly high numbers, take steps to get a bigger yield from the revenue, and raise the customs duties and other taxes. But the trouble still continued to fall. The little territory of the Crimea could not possibly feed the army. There were no exports, and consumption exceeded production. Emza Bernatsky, Minister of Finance, was quite right when he said that only a foreign loan could bolster up the ruble, but under the prevailing conditions, we could not be sure of getting a loan. As the cost of living rose, things grew difficult for the urban population, especially the workmen. The hostile elements in our midst profited from this at once, and for some days past a certain amount of excitement had been noticeable amongst the factory hands of Sebastopol. They were organizing a strike. If this materialized, we would be in a dreadful position. The factories were doing urgently necessary work, repairing artillery and machine guns, and preparing aircraft bombs and equipment for the fortifications. Except for the Cossack regiment of the Guard, there were no troops in Sebastopol. I decided to speak to the hands myself. I sent for their delegates and had a long interview with them. I told them that since April 9th, the Directors' Council of the administration had been considering how they could assist the workmen, and that at this very moment the commission, which was studying the question, had decided to raise the laborers' wages to the same level as that of the lower officials. In future, workmen's wages were to be raised whenever the salaries of these officials were raised, and in the same proportion. The wages fixed in this way were to serve as a basis for the calculation of the salaries of skilled employees. Furthermore, the laborers were to be given clothing and food from the military commissariat's reserve supplies, which would not be needed at the front. Prices were to be at the military commissariat's usual rates. The balance on the clothes was to be payable in a year's time, and only half the price of the food was to be paid on purchase. A scheme had been drawn up arranging for the opening of governmental shops in the towns and workmen's centers, which were to sell the necessities of life. The maximum available amount of provisions, manufactures, and other necessary merchandise was to be concentrated in these shops. They were to sell goods to workmen at reduced prices up to the value of 10% of their monthly wages. To begin with, 2 such shops were to be opened in Sebastopol. And finally, I informed the workmen of the hopeless state of our treasury and the inadequacy of our resources, and expressed my belief that they would appreciate all that the army was doing for them, for it was sharing its last farthing with them, and that they would support their efforts by continuing their work. When the workmen left me, they were obviously satisfied. The strike did not take place, and future attempts at agitation met with no success.